When I'm trying to think of good video ideas and I need a good topic to explain for a new video, I often try to think back to when I was learning the game, which really wasn't so long ago. Things like the importance of stealth rock or why U-turn is good might seem easy to understand for a seasoned vet, but are really hard to wrap your head around when you're just starting the game. But what I remember wanting to know more than anything back then was how to build a good team in Pokemon. I'd heard about a million times it doesn't matter how good you are, but if your team sucks, there's going to be not much that you can do. I knew that, but I didn't know what to do to get started on actually building a competitive team. Instead of just throwing 6 random Pokemon on and getting swept all the time and being frustrated with my lack of team building skills. At the time, I never really found exactly what I was looking for, so in service to my past self, I'm going to try to explain the process of building a strong, competitive Pokemon team to you, my audience. However, I don't want this to just be like a checklist of things to include in your team, which is ironic because I remember that's exactly what I wanted in my previous example I mentioned, but instead I'm going to give this teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime approach. This will not only help you build a team from the ground up and completely understand your teams much better than you would before, but it will also prepare you to make teams for any metagame, not just Sword and Shield. But that's going to mean we need to start with the very basics of team building, including what roles a Pokemon can fill on your team, the types of teams seen in competitive play, and how offensive and defensive cores work. I've also lined up a couple interviews with some really great top players to chime in on taking your team building to the next level. So that's all to say that there's going to be a couple of videos coming your way. I can't do this all in one video without it being like a feature-length film, so stay tuned on the channel for the next few weeks and you can expect those soon. However, our first topic when learning how to team build is properly understanding the roles that different Pokemon can perform on your team. Generally speaking, a Pokemon should be put onto your team for one of 3 reasons. 1, they act as a defensive check. 2, they give an offensive presence or pressure. Or 3, they provide some sort of utility to the team. Now, I don't want to go too in depth on the importance of defensive and offensive cores in team building just yet, because as I said, I'm planning to cover that in depth for a future episode. However, even though I'm not covering them just yet, I do want you to keep them in mind as a role to build your team. To explain what I mean by this, I'm going to provide an example. In a metagame like Black and White Overuse, it's really important that you include a defensive core that includes a flying type or levitate user to deal with all the ground types in the tier. But yes, as I said, let's leave that for future installments and just talk about what basic defensive archetypes you should have on your team. For our sakes, let's talk about some basic roles that your defensive Pokemon can fill. First, there's going to be walls. Like a physical wall, which can be used as a do-it-all tank for beating physical attackers, or a special wall for special attackers. There's also mixed walls that can do both, which is handy if you have a very offensive team, like this rain team, and you don't have spots in your team for multiple defensive Pokemon, or multiple walls in this case. Another important defensive role are status absorbers, or in a similar vein, magic guard users, who can be used to frequently swap into otherwise crippling status moves. And I'll also give a shout out to defensive pivots. These are defensive Pokemon that specialize in swapping in and out with ease, letting you keep up momentum for your team. Great examples of this can be found in Sword and Shield Overuse right now with Corviknight and Clefable, who can swap in on a Pokemon they wall and then pivot back out without skipping a beat. Now let's flip over from defensive Pokemon onto offensive roles for your team. I'm going to keep this brief because, like I said, I want to dive into the idea of offensive and defensive cores more in depth in the future. But for now, let's say this. This is Pokemon, and if you want to knock out your opponent, you're going to need some strong offensive pieces to attack and break through the tier's top defensive cores. Unless you're playing a stall team and you're planning to whittle down your opponent with slow residual damage, you're going to need attackers that can work together to break through any wall. Now, what kind of attackers can a team have exactly? First, there's sweepers. These are Pokemon whose objective is to be swapped in and have so much speed and attack power that they can knock out all of your opponent's Pokemon before they get a chance to attack back. This is commonly accomplished with a setup move that boosts your Pokemon's attacking stats, like a Swords Dance or a Shell Smash. But it can also be done by adding a speed boosting Choice Scarf to a very strong Pokemon like a Dracovish, or an attack boosting item like Choice Specs to a faster Pokemon like Dragapult. Hell, you can even use Trick Room to turn your super slow, super powerful Pokemon into speedy sweepers that your opponent can't resist. Speaking of those stronger and slower Pokemon, there's also wall breakers, of course, who usually don't care about setting up or having a great speed stat like the sweepers do. They just care about hitting as hard as possible. And as their name implies, they want to have so much attack power that they can even break through your opponent's best defensive Pokemon. The next offensive category is going to be speed control. I'm keeping this one nice and broad because there's a lot of little different mini types of speed control that you can include and fit into this category. One example of that is going to be a Choice Scarfer, usually a strong Pokemon who can pivot in frequently to threaten a revenge kill or threaten the opponent out, and sometimes even sweep the opponent in a late game. So I can usually call that a latent sweeper. Then there's just general speedsters like Dragapult this generation, or Jolteon was famous for it in previous generations, whose very high speed stat and wide move pool lets them accomplish similar goals to the Scarfers, without needing the Choice Scarf and being restricted to just one move. And the final subcategory, I guess, that I put into speed control is priority users. So this is a Pokemon like Conkeldurr or maybe like a Choice Band and Mamoswine, whose priority move is really strong and kind of lets them act similarly to those other speed demons I mentioned. And this is kind of a pseudo speed control because, as you can probably guess, it's not quite as versatile or flexible as those other speedsters I mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, it can be even better in some situations, and it can be essential if you're facing down a really threatening or a super fast Pokemon that's about to sweep you, as it can act with +1 priority. And I'll cap this section off on offensive roles with offensive pivots. These are of course going to be very similar to your defensive pivots, but instead of providing utility and lots of defensive synergy like your Corviknight per se, these Pokemon are more focused on generating offensive pressure and forcing swaps, like an Incineroar does nowadays or Choice Scarf Landorus Therian used to do. Now there are probably a lot of other specific offensive roles I could think of, but I think I'm just going to leave it there for now. Nice and simple. If you want a deeper analysis of the Wall Breaker, Sweeper, and Cleaner rules, you can find them broken down in my Hyper Offense video here. I'm also intentionally leaving Weather out of this list because I think it deserves its own set of videos, but just know for now that these are generally pretty offensive roles in modern Pokemon at least, looking to sweep and go for these huge attacking sprees after they set up the weather. But once again, I'm going to dive into that into a future series, so stay tuned. But now for our final category of roles to include in your team, we have utility. This is a pretty broad category, as there's definitely a lot of different utility roles you can squeeze into your team if you have the room. In fact, I would say one of the biggest advantages to playing stall teams nowadays is that by not trying to make room for purely offensive pieces, you can afford to give your Pokemon a lot of utility as a result. But in general, adding utility is always useful in team building, whether it's offensive or defensive. It should always be considered. This is because some aspects, like hazard control is what I would consider utility, are nearly essential in modern Pokemon. So speaking of which, if we're breaking down this category, the first and most important utility role you can have in your team is of course going to be your hazard setters. So things like Stealth Rocks, Spikes, Webs, and Toxic Spikes. Following that up is the next most important, which is hazard removal, namely your Rapid Spinners or Defoggers. However, there's also Pokemon with sort of a pseudo-hazard control, like Hatterene's Magic Bounce and Cinderace's Court Change. And hell, while we're on hazards, let's go a notch even deeper. Let's get really into it. There's also Spin Blockers, which are ghost types that counter Rapid Spinners by not being affected by the move, as they are with all fighting and normal type moves. If you're trying to control hazards, this is a great tool to have on your team to prevent rapid spins. Meanwhile, preventing enemy defogs is a little bit more difficult. If you can't taunt the enemy to prevent a defog first, or sack a Pokemon to get rid of the defog, your best bet would be to use a pseudo check to that in a Defiant user like Bisharp, or a contrary user in something like a Superior. These usually give you some great boost to your Pokemon for free, but of course it's not exactly stopping it full stop, but it's just an extra tool to keep in mind if you're trying to disincentivize it. Another classic piece of utility is status. If you can find room for it on your Pokemon, an extra Thunder Wave or Toxic or Will-O-Wisp is always helpful and always appreciated. And very popular this generation is Wish Passing, which can add recovery to Pokemon on your team without their own. Clefable in particular, with its amazing Wish teleport set, is absolutely dominating the meta at the moment. You can find more about Clefable right here, of course. In a similar vein, Clerics who can heal status are always helpful. Clefable can accomplish this too with Aromatherapy. There's also stall breaking rules for somewhat fast Pokemon who can use Taunt or Encore, even knockoff and status moves to ruin enemy stall teams' longevity. And for now, rounding out my list of utility moves to include, also throw Tailwind, Screen Setters, and Phasers. I think that covers it for now, but of course there's so many little niche moves in the game. I might addendum this with some items I missed, but I'm going to leave it there for now. So now that you've seen the huge dumb list of all the roles in Pokemon, you're probably a little bit freaked out. I can get to my next point, which I think is really important, which is the idea of role compression. There are so many things and so many roles and so many moves you can include on your Pokemon. It's impossible to have everything. If you put Taunt on your Tornadus for utility, it might have to lose Heat Wave, and that's just going to weaken your team's offense. On the flip side, if you include an extra Rapid Spinner on your team to help control those hazards, that might be one less sweeper you can afford on your team. The very intrinsic challenge of team building in Pokemon is understanding you can't put everything you want into a single team, and you can't prepare for every eventuality an opponent might bring you. Half the fun is trying to squeeze as many tools onto your team as possible. It's important you understand this, because then it makes it easier to understand why Pokemon like Fable and Corviknight are so insanely popular right now. If I'm having a hard time fitting a Scarfer onto my team, and I need to compress 2 roles down, let's say I have Amandabuzz's role as a defensive pivot and a defogger, and I can combine that with Cobalion Steel typing and Stall Breaking Taunt into one Pokemon, which is a defogging Taunt Corviknight. This role compression is exactly what creates such a lopsided usage stats in Pokemon. Having a Pokemon that can do all these different roles for you and compress it into one is so enormously useful. But hey, I think that's going to do it for now. It's quickly becoming my catchphrase at this point, but that went on way longer than I expected. So that's going to do it for this episode. Stay tuned for my next entry into this team building series. I'm going to teach you how these roles that I just discussed fit fit into different types of Pokemon teams. If you enjoyed the video, likes and subscriptions are super appreciated. But thanks again, take it easy.